London, May 1816. The pre-dawn streets of Southwark carried the acrid stench of coal smoke and desperation, a fitting companion to the closed carriage that rattled over uneven cobblestones toward an address no respectable woman should know. Inside that dark conveyance, 20-year-old Rosalind Merrick sat with her spine pressed against cracked leather, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white as bone. She knew exactly where this carriage was taking her. Her mother had made no effort to disguise the transaction, counting the £40 with the clinical efficiency of a tradesman settling accounts. £40, the price of 2 years of modest household expenses, or one season gown for a lady of quality, or the dignity and future of a physician's daughter, who had committed the unforgivable sin of being born female and penniless. The carriage slowed. Through the grimy window, Rosalind glimpsed the establishment that would be her prison until she turned 21, and the law might offer some threadbare protection. Mrs. Fletcher's house stood 3 stories tall, its windows glowing with lamplight that promised warmth but delivered only a different kind of cold. Her fingers moved to the small leather-bound book hidden in her pocket, the last of her father's medical texts she had managed to keep when everything else was sold. If she could survive this, perhaps in a year she might escape, might find work as an apothecary's assistant, might reclaim some fragment of the life she had imagined before her father's death had stripped away every illusion of security. The door handle turned. Rosalind straightened her shoulders and prepared to face her fate with the only thing she had left to call her own, her dignity. If stories of courage in impossible circumstances move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. The carriage door opened, but instead of Mrs. Fletcher's heavy-set doorman, a gentleman's face appeared in the frame. Dark eyes, sharp features, an expression of controlled urgency that seemed utterly incongruous with the sordid surroundings. "Miss Merrick," the stranger said, his voice pitched low but carrying absolute authority. "I am Adrian Stratford, Earl of Montrose. You will come with me now." Rosalind stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of an earl appearing in Southwark at 5 in the morning with any rational explanation. Earls did not intercept carriages bound for brothels. Earls did not know the names of physicians' daughters about to be sold into degradation. "I understand your confusion," Lord Montrose continued, extending his hand with the same calm assurance one might use to assist a lady from her carriage at a society ball. "My solicitor alerted me to your situation 2 hours ago. If you wish to avoid the fate your mother arranged, take my hand and trust me for a single minute." Behind him, Rosalind could see Mrs. Fletcher herself emerging from the establishment's doorway, her painted face contorting with annoyance at this unexpected interference. The woman had paid £40, and she clearly intended to collect her due. Rosalind looked at the Earl's extended hand, then at the book in her pocket, then at the future that waited behind Mrs. Fletcher's door. She placed her trembling fingers in his steady grip and allowed him to pull her from the carriage. "My lord," Mrs. Fletcher began, her voice dripping false deference. "There seems to be some misunderstanding. The girl's mother sold her to me legally. The contract is signed." "A contract signed by a parent to sell their child into prostitution," Lord Montrose replied, his tone so cold it could have frozen the Thames, "is not worth the paper it wastes. I suggest you take your £40 and consider yourself fortunate I do not have you arrested for trafficking in human misery." He did not wait for her response. Within moments, Rosalind found herself being handed into a proper carriage, bearing a coat of arms she vaguely recognized from the few society papers she had glimpsed in better days. The Earl settled across from her, signaled his driver, and the carriage lurched into motion toward Mayfair. "My sister," he said without preamble, his gaze fixing on a point somewhere past Rosalind's shoulder. "She was nearly sold to the same establishment 5 years ago by a corrupt governess who forged my father's signature. I arrived moments too late to prevent the initial exchange. I managed to buy her back, but the terror I saw in her eyes has haunted me ever since. I failed her protection once. When my confidential inquiries alert me to similar transactions now, I intervene." "Your confidential inquiries," Rosalind repeated faintly. You maintain agents in Suffolk to rescue women. I maintain ears in multiple locations to prevent young women from being destroyed by those who should protect them, he corrected. What happens next is your choice, Miss Merrick, but I would suggest you prepare yourself for a rather formidable interview. The carriage pulled up before a magnificent townhouse in Grosvenor Square, and Rosalind was ushered inside with such speed she barely had time to register the opulence of the marble entrance hall before being conducted to an elegant drawing room. There, seated in a high-backed chair like a queen holding court, was the most intimidating woman Rosalind had ever encountered. Lady Constance Stratford, Dowager Countess of Montrose, was 72 years old and possessed the kind of steely composure that made younger women quail. Her silver hair was arranged in perfect coils, her morning dress was impeccable despite the ungodly hour, and her pale blue eyes examined Rosalind with the thoroughness of a general inspecting questionable troops. "Adrian," she said without shifting her gaze from Rosalind, "explain this madness." The Earl moved to stand beside his grandmother's chair. "A proposal, as you have so frequently requested. You wish me to marry. Here is my candidate. I am offering you 3 months to transform Miss Merrick into suitable countess material. If she passes your rigorous standards and wishes to accept my offer of marriage, we shall wed. If not, she receives £2,000 as a dowry to establish herself independently, and legal documentation severing her mother's claim on her person or property." The dowager's eyebrows rose fractionally. "A physician's daughter, with no connections, no training, no fortune, sold by her own mother for the price of a decent mare. And you believe I can create a countess from such unpromising material?" "I believe," the Earl replied calmly, "that you have never refused a challenge in your life, and that Miss Merrick possesses more natural dignity in her current dishevelled state than most diamonds of the first water display in their finest jewels." Lady Constance turned her full attention to Rosalind. "Speak, girl. Can you read?" "Yes, my lady." Rosalind's voice emerged stronger than she had expected. "Latin and Greek as well as English. My father believed daughters should be educated. Can you conduct intelligent conversation? On medical matters, philosophy and literature, yes. On the latest scandals and fashion, I fear I am woefully ignorant. The former can be hidden, the latter taught. Can you learn quickly? I taught myself advanced mathematics from my father's university texts when I was 15. Something that might have been approval flickered in the dowager's expression. And if I refuse this absurd scheme, what then will you do? Rosalind met those intimidating pale eyes directly. Survive, my lady, as I have survived everything else. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Lady Constance smiled, sharp as a blade. 3 months. If you fail a single test, you receive £1,000 and are sent away with a character reference as a governess. If you succeed and refuse Adrian's offer, £2,000 and my blessing. If you succeed and accept, you become my granddaughter and the Countess of Montrose. Do you accept these terms?" "What is the alternative?" Rosalind asked. The Earl answered. "You may refuse and choose to live modestly on a small pension I will provide as a governess or companion. However, your mother retains legal authority over you until you reach 21. She could, theoretically, challenge my guardianship and reclaim you." Rosalind understood the trap perfectly. With her mother's demonstrated willingness to sell her own child, there would be no safety in independence until the law itself provided protection. "Then I accept your bargain, my lady. I will do everything in my power to pass your tests." "Everything begins at 6 tomorrow morning," Lady Constance declared. "You will be provided a bedchamber, appropriate clothing, and exactly 4 hours of sleep. Use them wisely." The training that began the following dawn made every previous hardship in Rosalind's life seem gentle by comparison. Lady Constance proved to be a relentless instructor whose standards would have made a military commander seem lenient. From 6 in the morning until 10 at night, Rosalind endured lessons in posture, deportment, French conversation, Italian literature, pianoforte, watercolors, needlework, dance, and the intricate social codes that governed every interaction among the aristocracy. The first morning began with posture. Lady Constance positioned Rosalind before a full-length mirror and proceeded to catalogue every flaw with the precision of a natural philosopher dissecting a specimen. How your shoulders slump forward as though you wish to disappear into yourself, the dowager observed. I understand the impulse, Miss Merrick, but a countess does not shrink. She occupies space with authority. Rosalind straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back. Better, but now you appear rigid as a soldier on parade. Grace, child. Think of a swan moving across still water. The strength is hidden beneath elegant motion. For 2 hours, Rosalind walked the length of the drawing room with books stacked on her head. When the first volume tumbled to the carpet, Lady Constance's expression did not change. Again, she commanded simply. By the 10th repetition, Rosalind's neck ached and her legs trembled with fatigue. By the 20th, she wanted to scream. By the 30th, she managed 3 complete circuits without losing a single book. Adequate for a first attempt, Lady Constance said, which Rosalind was learning represented high praise. Tomorrow we shall add turning and bowing to the exercise. French lessons followed immediately after breakfast. Rosalind had learned to read the language from her father's medical texts, but conversation proved another matter entirely. Madame Dubois, a sharp-faced woman who had fled France during the Revolution, tolerated no errors. Non, 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 she exclaimed when Rosalind stumbled over a subjunctive conjugation. A lady does not mumble or hesitate. She speaks with clarity and confidence, even when discussing the weather. Again. By the end of the first week, Rosalind dreamed in French and woke with her jaw aching from the unfamiliar shapes her mouth had been forced to make. But she could conduct basic conversation about art, literature, and society without grammatical embarrassment. Pianoforte lessons tested her patience most severely. Her fingers, strong from years of household work, lacked the flexibility required for complex passages. Professor Aldrich, an elderly man with wispy white hair and the temperament of a frustrated artist, tapped out rhythm with a wooden stick against the instrument's frame. Tempo, Miss Merrick. Music is not merely notes pressed in sequence. It is conversation, emotion, the expression of what cannot be spoken. One afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows, Rosalind sat at the instrument, her frustration boiling over. She struck a dissonant chord and dropped her head into her hands, convinced she would never master the delicate touch required. "You fight the instrument," a voice said from the doorway. Rosalind started, turning to see the Earl watching her. It was the first time he had observed her practice. "I am trying to conquer it, my lord," she confessed, rubbing her aching temples. "It seems to resist my authority." "Music cannot be conquered, only courted," he said, moving into the room. He did not offer to play, but stood near the instrument, his presence solid and grounding. "You approach the keys as if they are a medical problem to be solved. Try approaching them as a story to be told. What are you trying to say?" "That I am tired," she admitted, with a small, weary smile. "And that I am afraid I shall fail you." "Play that then," he said softly. Rosalind turned back to the keys. She played slowly, abandoning the rigid tempo Professor Aldrich demanded, letting the notes reflect her exhaustion and her fear. It was imperfect, but it was real. When she finished, she looked up to find Adrian watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He said nothing, simply nodded once before turning to leave, but the moment of shared understanding lingered long after he was gone. Dance proved both easier and more complicated. The steps themselves were logical, almost mathematical in their precision. Rosalind learned the minuet, the cotillion, the country dance, committing each pattern to memory with the same systematic approach she had once used to memorize botanical classifications. But learning steps in an empty ballroom with a patient instructor was entirely different from executing them in company while maintaining conversation. "You must appear utterly at ease," Lady Constance instructed during one particularly frustrating session. "Dancing is performance. Every gentleman who partners you will judge not just your steps, but your composure, your conversation, your ability to make him feel clever and valued without appearing obsequious." "How does one manage all that while counting steps and avoiding his feet?" Rosalind asked with genuine frustration. "Practice until it becomes instinctive. Then practice more." The middle of the training period brought a crisis that nearly ended the entire arrangement. During a practice tea service, Rosalind, exhausted from a sleepless night studying heraldry, accidentally used the wrong spoon for the sugar. It was a minor error, but Lady Constance froze. "Stop," the Dowager commanded, her voice devoid of warmth. "We have been at this for weeks, Miss Merrick, and you still fumble like a milkmaid. Perhaps Adrian was wrong. Perhaps breeding cannot be taught." Rosalind set the saucer down, her hands shaking. "It was a momentary lapse, my lady. A countess does not have lapses. A countess is a standard-bearer for her family. If you cannot master a spoon, how will you master a dinner for royalty? I am wasting my time." Lady Constance rose to leave. "No," Rosalind said, the word ringing out in the silent room. She stood, barring the Dowager's path. "You are not wasting your time, and I am not a milkmaid. I am a woman fighting for her life. I know the chemical composition of the sugar, the geography of the tea's origin, and the anatomy of the hand holding the spoon. I made a mistake because I am human, not because I am incapable. Sit down, my lady. I will pour it again, and I will do it perfectly." Lady Constance stared at her, the silence stretching taut as a bowstring. For a moment, Rosalind thought she would be dismissed. Then, slowly, the Dowager sat. "Again," she said, "and do not spill a drop." Rosalind poured. She did not spill. The evenings were reserved for instruction in the elaborate social codes that governed aristocratic interaction. Rosalind learned which topics were appropriate for morning calls versus dinner conversation. She learned the precise depth of curtsy owed to different ranks, the proper forms of address, the subtle signals by which society communicated approval or disapproval. "You must master the art of saying nothing while appearing to say much," Lady Constance explained over tea one afternoon. "Observe Lady Margaret Whitfield when she calls tomorrow. She is a kind woman, but an inveterate gossip. You must be warm without being confidential, interested without appearing eager for scandal." The watercolor lessons with Miss Hartwell revealed that Rosalind had absolutely no natural talent for visual art. Her trees looked like misshapen lumps, her flowers like colored blots. By the fourth lesson, Miss Hartwell quietly suggested to Lady Constance that needlework might prove more suitable. Needlework, at least, involved patterns and precision that Rosalind's mind could grasp. Throughout these first weeks, the Earl appeared only at dinner, a formal affair where they sat at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 20. The distance seemed both literal and metaphorical. He would inquire politely about her progress, listen to his grandmother's reports with apparent interest, and then excuse himself. Rosalind found herself watching for these brief interactions with an intensity that surprised her. She noticed how his expression softened when he spoke to elderly servants, how his hands moved with unconscious grace when he carved meat or poured wine. During one dinner in the third week, Lady Constance mentioned a case of fever in the servants' quarters. The Earl's immediate response was to summon the finest physician in London and order that the affected staff be moved to better ventilated rooms with round-the-clock care. "They have served this family faithfully," he said simply, when his grandmother raised an eyebrow at the elaborate arrangements. "We owe them our care in return." That night, Rosalind asked permission to visit the sick servants, carrying with her the remedies her father had taught her to prepare. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, initially resisted allowing the Earl's guest into the servants' quarters, but Rosalind's quiet insistence won the day. She found 3 maids and 1 footman suffering from what appeared to be influenza. Their care was adequate, but Rosalind suggested adjustments to their positioning to ease breathing, recommended herbal infusions to reduce fever, and demonstrated methods for keeping them comfortable during chills. The Earl discovered her there near midnight, her day dress stained with medicinal preparations, her hair escaping its pins, her hands gentle as she helped a frightened young maid drink water. "Miss Merrick," he said from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "This is hardly necessary. The physician will return tomorrow." "The physician," Rosalind replied without looking up from her patient, "prescribed laudanum and bleeding. Both will weaken them further. Cool compresses, fluids, and rest will serve them better." "You disagree with trained medical opinion? Based on what education?" "Based on my father's 20 years of rural practice and my own observation of what actually helps patients recover, rather than what ancient theory suggests should help." He was silent for a long moment, Then, surprisingly, he moved into the room and helped her reposition the footman to ease his labored breathing. They worked side by side for nearly an hour, and when all 4 patients rested more comfortably, he walked her back to the main house through darkened corridors. "Your father taught you well," he said quietly. "He taught me to observe rather than assume, to trust evidence over authority when they conflict, to remember that patients are people, not theoretical problems to be solved. Those are revolutionary principles in medicine. They are principles that save lives, which should not be revolutionary at all." After that night, something shifted subtly in their interactions. The Earl still maintained proper distance, but his questions at dinner became more specific, more genuinely curious. He asked about her father's practice, about cases she remembered, about her observations on the relationship between cleanliness and disease. The 4th week brought the first social test. Lady Constance arranged an intimate afternoon gathering with 3 carefully selected acquaintances. Lady Margaret Whitfield, cheerful and talkative, immediately put Rosalind at ease with questions about her Yorkshire upbringing. Mrs. Arabella Sutton, far more calculating, probed more carefully. "Your family's estate in Yorkshire," Mrs. Sutton said, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp. "I confess I am not familiar with the property." "It was quite modest," Rosalind replied, a prepared answer that held enough truth to be credible. "More a large house than a true estate. My father's practice was his primary occupation." "A physician? How unusual." Mrs. Sutton's expression revealed nothing. Most families of gentle birth avoid trade. "Healing the sick," Lady Constance interjected smoothly, "is hardly trade, Arabella. It is a calling. Miss Merrick's father was a Cambridge-educated man of considerable learning. His choice to practice medicine rather than pursue a living in the church or law speaks to his character, not against it." The subtle rebuke was clear, and Mrs. Sutton subsided. But Rosalind noted how the woman's gaze lingered, calculating, assessing, not hostile but not yet convinced. Miss Charlotte Winters, the 3rd visitor, proved the easiest to charm. Young, recently married, and desperately trying to navigate society's complexities herself, she responded to Rosalind's genuine interest with obvious relief. "I never know what to say at these grand functions," Charlotte confided during a private moment in the garden. "Everyone seems to speak in code, and I fear constantly that I shall commit some terrible breach of etiquette." "I share your concern entirely," Rosalind admitted. "Every rule seems to have exceptions, and the exceptions themselves follow patterns I cannot quite grasp. At least you have Lady Constance to guide you. My mother-in-law offers criticism, but rarely explanation. Then perhaps we might navigate these treacherous waters together. 2 confused souls are better than 1. Charlotte's grateful smile suggested Rosalind had made her first genuine friend among the aristocracy. The 5th week brought a crisis. During an Italian lesson, Rosalind's instructor, Signor Moretti, suggested she practice conversation by attending a musical evening hosted by an Italian expatriate family. Lady Constance approved the plan, and arrangements were made. The evening itself proved delightful. Rosalind's Italian, while not perfect, was adequate for discussing music and literature. She conversed with an elderly contessa about Dante, debated the merits of different composers with a visiting maestro, and felt for the first time that she might actually succeed in this impossible transformation. Then disaster struck. A gentleman she did not recognize approached during the interval and addressed her in rapid Italian, clearly assuming from her earlier conversations that she was fluent. Rosalind understood perhaps half of what he said and responded with what she thought was an appropriate comment about the performance. His shocked expression suggested she had said something terribly wrong. Later, near tears of frustration, she confessed the incident to Signor Moretti, who gently explained that her grammatical error had transformed a compliment about the soprano's vocal range into a crude comment about her physical attributes. The gentleman had been too polite to correct her, but the damage was done. "I am hopeless," Rosalind said that night to Lady Constance. "I study until my eyes burn and my head aches, but still I make mortifying errors. What gentleman would want such an inadequate wife?" The dowager regarded her with an expression that might have been sympathy. Do you know how many years I studied before I felt truly confident in society? 7. You have been training for 5 weeks. Your progress is not inadequate, Miss Merrick. It is extraordinary. You expect perfection when competence is the realistic goal. But if I embarrass Lord Montrose with such mistakes, Adrian is no fool. He knows exactly what he offered when he brought you here. A quick mind and determined spirit, not a polished debutante who has trained for this role since childhood. Your errors are expected and forgivable. Your surrender to discouragement would not be. The 6th week brought the carefully managed social exposures that Lady Constance had planned. Morning calls, afternoon teas, walks in Hyde Park during the fashionable hours. Each event was orchestrated to gradually expand Rosalind's circle of acquaintance while minimizing risk of disaster. She learned to navigate conversations about subjects of which she knew nothing, to deflect intrusive questions with polite vagueness, to remember dozens of names and relationships despite seeing many faces only briefly. Her mind, trained by medical study to observe and categorize, adapted to this new challenge with increasing skill. But the constant performance exhausted her. At night, alone in her bedchamber, she would sometimes retrieve her father's medical text and read passages, just to remember who she had been before this transformation began. The girl who had dreamed of assisting apothecaries seemed very distant from the young woman learning to curtsy to duchesses. During one particularly difficult week, when she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what was expected, Rosalind found herself in the estate library late at night, unable to sleep. She had discovered that the Earl's collection included several recent medical journals, and she was absorbed in an article about new theories regarding hospital cleanliness when a voice from the doorway startled her. "I had wondered who was reading those," the Earl said, entering the library. He wore a velvet dressing gown over his nightclothes, a breach of propriety that somehow seemed natural in the intimate darkness of the library. The household accounts suggested someone was going through them methodically. "I apologize, my lord. I should have asked permission." "You have it retroactively. What are you reading?" Dr. Hallow's treatise on contagion. He suggests that diseases spread through lack of cleanliness rather than bad air, which contradicts most accepted medical thought, but aligns with what my father observed in his practice. Adrian moved to examine the journal, standing close enough that she could smell the faint scent of tobacco and soap. The air in the library felt suddenly thick, charged with the awareness of their solitude and the late hour. "You disagree with established medical opinion. I think established medical opinion is often established by men who have never actually treated sick patients. They theorize from positions of comfortable ignorance, while practical physicians who see evidence contradicting their theories are dismissed as lacking proper education." "You sound passionate about the subject." His voice was low, intimate in the quiet room. "I am passionate about truth being determined by evidence rather than authority. It is why I found society so baffling when I first arrived. Here, truth seems determined entirely by who speaks it, rather than by any objective standard." He smiled, and in that expression Rosalind glimpsed the man beneath the aristocratic reserve. "You have identified precisely what makes society both powerful and absurd. We operate on collective delusion, maintained by rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules. Yet those rules provide structure, however artificial, that allows thousands of people to interact with minimal chaos. But at what cost? How many talented people are excluded because they lack the proper birth or training in meaningless skills? How many important truths are ignored because they come from sources society dismisses? All valid questions that I have asked myself for years, which is why I maintain agents in Southwark, why I support reforms to child welfare laws, why I brought you here rather than leaving you to the fate your mother arranged." They talked until dawn began to lighten the windows, discussing everything from medical theory to political philosophy. It was the longest conversation they had shared since her arrival, and when Rosalind finally retreated to her bedchamber for a few hours' sleep, she carried with her the memory of his smile, and the knowledge that beneath his careful reserve lived a mind as curious and questioning as her own. By the 6th week, Lady Constance declared her ready for limited social exposure. Carefully selected acquaintances were invited for afternoon calls, during which Rosalind was introduced as a distant relation newly arrived from Yorkshire. Lady Margaret Whitfield, a kindly woman in her 50s, seemed genuinely pleased to make her acquaintance. Mrs. Arabella Sutton, sharper-eyed and more calculating, examined Rosalind with obvious curiosity, but eventually nodded her approval. "Constance has worked one of her miracles," Lady Margaret murmured to her companion as they prepared to depart. "The girl is surprisingly accomplished." "Surprisingly indeed," Mrs. Sutton agreed, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. The 8th week brought the great test. Lord and Lady Worthington were hosting one of the season's most important balls, and Lady Constance had secured an invitation for Rosalind's formal introduction to society. For 3 days before the event, every moment was devoted to preparation. Rosalind's gown, a creation of ice-blue silk that brought out the unusual color of her grey eyes, was fitted and refitted until it achieved perfection. Her dance steps were practiced until she could execute every figure blindfolded. Her conversational topics were rehearsed until she could discuss literature, music, and current events with apparent, effortless grace. The modiste Madame Laurent had outdone herself with the gown. The silk shimmered in lamplight, and the cut was elegant without being ostentatious. Small seed pearls decorated the bodice in a pattern that suggested waves, and the sleeves were designed to allow freedom of movement while maintaining perfect propriety. "You look like a duchess already," Charlotte Winters said when she came to call the afternoon before the ball. "I confess, I am envious. My own wedding gown cost a fortune but never fit quite right." Rosalind studied her reflection in the long mirror and barely recognized herself. 8 weeks ago she had been wearing a stained traveling dress, headed for degradation in Suffolk. Now she appeared every inch a lady of quality. The transformation was so complete it felt almost like disguise. Lady Constance supervised every detail with her characteristic precision. "Your fan must be ivory to match the pearls. Wear the garnet earrings Adrian's mother left you. They provide the only color accent needed. Hair dressed high to show your neck, but not so elaborate as to appear you're trying too hard. Remember, confidence is essential. You belong in these spaces as much as any woman born to them." The night of the ball arrived with the inexorable weight of Judgment Day. Rosalind descended the staircase of Montrose House to find both the Earl and his grandmother waiting in the entrance hall. Adrian wore full evening dress, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his cravat tied in an intricate pattern that must have taken his valet considerable effort. When he looked up and saw her, something in his expression changed so subtly that only someone watching carefully would notice. Lady Constance examined her from head to toe with clinical precision. "Adequate," she pronounced, which from her was the highest praise. "Remember, you are neither apologetic nor arrogant. You are simply yourself, which is sufficient. If anyone questions your place there, remember that you earned this through effort they can scarcely imagine. Walk with confidence, speak with clarity, and trust your training." The Earl offered his arm, his expression unreadable. "Ready, Miss Merrick?" "As ready as training can make me," Rosalind replied, placing her gloved hand on his sleeve and feeling the solid strength of muscle beneath expensive fabric. The carriage ride to Worthington House was brief, but felt interminable. Adrian maintained polite conversation about neutral topics, while Rosalind tried to control the nervous flutter in her stomach. Through the carriage window, she could see other conveyances converging on the same destination, their occupants dressed in their finest, secure in their right to attend such events. Worthington House blazed with hundreds of candles, their light glittering off crystal chandeliers, and the jewels adorning the assembled guests. The entrance hall alone was grander than any building Rosalind had ever entered in her previous life. Marble columns soared toward painted ceilings, enormous mirrors reflected the crowd back upon itself, and the sound of orchestra music drifted down from the ballroom on the first floor. As Rosalind entered on the Earl's arm, she felt the weight of hundreds of curious eyes turning in her direction. She recognized the feeling from medical texts describing specimens under examination. The whispers began immediately, a soft susurration like wind through autumn leaves. "Who is that with Montrose? I have never seen her before. Rather pretty, but who are her people?" Lady Constance moved slightly ahead, her imperious presence clearing a path through the crowd. Rosalind focused on her breathing, on maintaining perfect posture, on appearing utterly at ease despite the scrutiny. They were announced at the ballroom entrance, and the orchestra continued playing without pause, but Rosalind could feel the attention of everyone present. The first hour passed in a blur of introductions. Adrian presented her to Lord and Lady Worthington, who received her with polite but reserved courtesy. Lady Margaret Whitfield embraced her warmly and immediately began introducing her to other matrons, which helped immensely. Charlotte Winters appeared with her husband, providing a friendly face in the sea of strangers. But not everyone was friendly. Lady Victoria Ashworth, resplendent in burgundy silk that must have cost more than many families earned in a year, watched from across the room with an expression that combined assessment with something harder. The woman was beautiful in the classical sense, with perfect features and bearing that came from a lifetime of privilege. She had been considered the most likely candidate for the position of Countess of Montrose, and her interest in Adrian had been obvious to everyone. During a brief moment, when Adrian was claimed by some gentlemen discussing parliamentary matters, Lady Victoria approached with her companion, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Langley. "Miss Merrick," Lady Victoria said, her smile bright and utterly insincere. "How delightful to meet Montrose's mysterious protégé. You have appeared so suddenly that one hardly knows what to make of it." "I am pleased to make your acquaintance, Lady Victoria," Rosalind replied, remembering Lady Constance's instruction to respond to rudeness with perfect courtesy. "You must find all of this rather overwhelming. The season, the society, the expectations. It is such a different world from provincial life. Every world has its own complexities, I find. What appears simple often contains depths invisible to casual observation." Mrs. Langley's eyebrows rose slightly. "How philosophical. Do you often speak in such abstractions, or is it nervousness that makes you vague?" Before Rosalind could respond, Adrian materialized at her elbow with the timing of someone who had been watching the interaction carefully. "Lady Victoria, Mrs. Langley, I trust you are both enjoying the evening. If you will excuse us, I believe the next set is forming, and I have promised Miss Merrick this dance." He led Rosalind onto the floor for a cotillion, positioning them in the set with practiced ease. As the music began and they executed the figures, he spoke quietly during the brief moments when the pattern brought them together. "Victoria can be venomous when she chooses. Do not let her disturb you. She believes I have taken something that should have been hers. She assumed an interest on my part that I never expressed. Her disappointment is not your responsibility." The dance required them to separate, to partner with others in the set, but Rosalind's mind remained on his words. He had never expressed interest in Lady Victoria despite her beauty, wealth, and perfect suitability. What did that mean about his own heart? The second dance was a waltz, a dance that was still considered scandalous by the more conservative patronesses of Almack's. It required them to maintain much closer contact. Adrian's hand settled at her waist, his touch radiating heat through the silk of her gown. As they moved together across the polished floor, Rosalind was acutely aware of the dangerous intimacy of the moment, the way their bodies moved in synchronized rhythm, isolated in the midst of the crowd. "You dance beautifully," he said quietly, his gaze locked on hers. "Years of practice condensed into weeks of terror," she replied, trying to steady her breath. "I still count beats in my head." "Most people do. They are simply better at hiding it. You appear utterly confident. Then the performance is working. It is not merely performance. You have transformed yourself through sheer determination. That is remarkable." His praise warmed her more than it should have. They completed the waltz, and he returned her to Lady Constance's side, where she was immediately claimed by a young gentleman for the next set. Then another, and another. By the time supper was announced, Rosalind had danced with 7 different partners, navigated countless conversations, and begun to believe she might actually succeed. The formal announcement came halfway through the evening. Lord Worthington requested the attention of the assembled guests, and the orchestra fell silent. Adrian had stepped forward to the center of the ballroom, and all eyes turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded space, "it is my great pleasure to introduce to society Miss Rosalind Merrick, who has honored me by accepting my offer of marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Rosalind could hear the snap of fans closing and the rustle of silk as every guest froze. It was a terrible, suffocating quiet. Rosalind stood frozen, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The entire glittering assembly held its collective breath, and into that frozen moment, the whispers began like the first drops of a coming storm. Merrick. I have never heard the name. No connections whatsoever. Where did Montrose find her? She appeared from nowhere. Lady Margaret Whitfield began applauding, bless her kind heart, and others slowly joined in. But the underlying current of shock and speculation was palpable. Rosalind maintained her composure, smiled graciously, and accepted congratulations from those who approached, but she could feel the scrutiny intensifying. Lady Victoria materialized beside the refreshment table, her expression frozen in a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How delightful," she said in a carrying voice. "Lord Montrose's charity extends even to the entirely obscure. One can only admire such democratic principles." The calculated cruelty of the comment was clear to everyone within earshot. Several ladies looked uncomfortable, but no one directly contradicted someone of Lady Victoria's rank and influence. Rosalind opened her mouth to respond with the dignified deflection Lady Constance had taught her for such situations. Before she could speak, the ballroom doors were thrown open. A disheveled woman in a stained traveling dress pushed past a distracted footman who tried vainly to stop her. Her wild eyes scanned the crowd until they fixed on Rosalind. "Rosalind!" Mrs. Helena Merrick's voice cut through the music like a knife through silk. "How dare you stand there pretending to be a lady?" The orchestra stuttered to a halt. Every person in the ballroom turned to witness this spectacular breach of decorum. Time seemed to slow as Rosalind watched her mother advance across the polished floor, leaving muddy footprints in her wake. The woman was thinner than Rosalind remembered, her face lined with bitterness. "This girl," Mrs. Helena gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Rosalind, "is my daughter, my own flesh and blood. I sold her for £40 to pay debts she helped create, and now she plays at being a countess while abandoning her own mother." The whispers exploded into a roar of shocked exclamations. Rosalind stood frozen, watching her entire carefully constructed future crumble into dust. 3 months of brutal training, every lesson learned, every standard met, all destroyed in 30 seconds by the woman who had given her birth and then sold her like livestock. Around her, she could see the calculation in dozens of eyes. A physician's daughter, sold by her own mother, for £40. The Earl's mysterious protégé was revealed as nothing more than a charity case, damaged goods elevated far above her proper station. Lady Victoria's expression transformed into something approaching triumph. Mrs. Langley whispered urgently to her companions, spreading the scandal with gleeful efficiency. Even Lady Margaret looked shocked and uncertain, her earlier warmth suddenly complicated by social calculation. The Earl's hand closed around Rosalind's wrist, steadying her when she thought her knees might give way. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold authority that commanded immediate silence. "Mrs. Merrick," he said, stepping between Rosalind and her mother, "you signed a legal document renouncing all parental rights and claims to your daughter in exchange for financial compensation. That document is witnessed, sealed, and filed with my solicitor. If you violate its terms again by approaching Miss Merrick or spreading slander about her character, I will have you prosecuted for extortion and fraud. Remove her." 2 footmen finally materialized and escorted the protesting woman from the ballroom. But the damage was catastrophically complete. Every person present now knew the truth. A physician's daughter of no consequence, sold by her own mother, rescued by the Earl like some character from a melodramatic novel. Rosalind turned to face Lady Constance, expecting dismissal and disgrace. Instead, the Dowager stepped forward and placed one hand on her shoulder. "The revelation of one's origins," Lady Constance said clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, "is far less significant than the demonstration of one's character. Miss Merrick has conducted herself with perfect propriety for the past 2 months. That her mother is a mercenary wretch reflects on the mother, not the daughter." Lady Margaret Whitfield nodded vigorously. "Quite right, Constance. The girl cannot be blamed for her mother's wickedness." But the whispers continued, and Rosalind saw the calculation in dozens of eyes. Social disaster of this magnitude could not be easily overcome. She had become not just a curiosity, but a scandal, and scandals were contagious among the aristocracy. That night, back at Montrose House, Rosalind stood in the library where this impossible bargain had first been explained to her. "I have destroyed everything," she said quietly to the Earl, who had followed her there. "The bargain has failed. Your reputation will suffer if you proceed." "The bargain," he replied, "continues. How?" She turned to face him, exhausted and defeated. "Society will never accept me now. Your grandmother's efforts were wasted. I should take whatever small pension you offer and disappear." "Miss Merrick," the Earl said, and something in his tone made her pause. "Do you truly believe I would abandon you to face the consequences of your mother's malice alone? I am not a man who retreats from challenges. This is not your challenge to face. You became my responsibility the moment I pulled you from that carriage in Southwark. I do not take such responsibilities lightly." The following morning brought an unexpected development. A royal messenger arrived at Montrose House bearing a summons for Miss Rosalind Merrick to attend upon His Royal Highness the Prince Regent at Carlton House that very afternoon. Lady Constance received this news with a rare expression of surprise. The prince rarely involves himself in social scandals unless they amuse him particularly. This could be salvation or destruction, and there is no way to predict which. "Should I prepare particular responses?" Rosalind asked, her stomach knotting with anxiety. The humiliation of the previous evening still burned fresh, and the thought of facing royal judgment in her current vulnerable state was almost too much to bear. "You should be yourself," Lady Constance replied. "George appreciates honesty above flattery, intelligence above beauty, and genuine passion above polished performance. If he has summoned you, it is because something about your situation intrigued him. Do not attempt to present some calculated version of yourself. That would bore him, and a bored prince is far more dangerous than an amused one." The preparations for the royal audience consumed the morning. Rosalind's day dress was selected with care, something elegant but not ostentatious, appropriate for afternoon, but respectful of the formality required. Her hair was dressed simply, her jewelry minimal. She looked, as Lady Constance observed with approval, like a gentlewoman of quality and intelligence, rather than a social climber attempting to dazzle with finery. The Earl insisted on accompanying her to Carlton House, though protocol required he wait while she was conducted to the prince's presence. During the carriage ride, he seemed unusually tense. "The prince knew my father well," Adrian said, breaking a long silence. "When I explained your situation to him several weeks ago, he expressed interest in meeting you. I had hoped to arrange it under more controlled circumstances, after you were established and secure. Last night's disaster accelerated his timeline." "You told him about me weeks ago?" Rosalind stared at him. "Before society even knew I existed?" "I sought his advice, and if I am being honest, his protection. A word from the Prince Regent carries more weight than 100 noble sponsors. But I wanted you to meet him when you felt confident, not when you were raw from public humiliation." "What did you tell him about me?" "The truth, that I encountered a young woman of considerable intelligence and dignity being sold into degradation by her own mother, that I offered her an opportunity to transform her circumstances, that she had exceeded every expectation in her training, that I believed her capable of remarkable things if given the chance to prove herself." Rosalind was silent, absorbing this revelation. He had been planning her protection, her success, her future, even while maintaining such careful distance. The contradiction between his actions and his apparent reserve confused her. Carlton House was even more magnificent than Worthington House, its rooms decorated with an opulence that bordered on excessive. The walls were covered with silk damask in rich colors, the ceilings were painted with elaborate scenes from classical mythology, and everywhere she looked were treasures that would have funded a hospital for years. Rosalind found herself mentally calculating the cost of a single chandelier in terms of how many indigent patients could be treated. She was conducted through corridors lined with priceless art to a music room where the Prince Regent himself waited. George was in his 50s, portly but still possessing an air of authority, dressed in elaborate clothing that somehow suited his flamboyant personality. He examined her with shrewd, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Merrick," he said without preamble, gesturing to a magnificent instrument that dominated one end of the room. "Montrose tells me you play the pianoforte with some skill. Demonstrate, if you please. I am dreadfully bored of debutantes playing the same 3 pieces badly." It was not a request. Rosalind moved to the instrument, her mind racing. She could play competently after 8 weeks of intensive instruction, but competent would not impress a prince who employed the finest musicians in England. He would have heard technical perfection countless times. What he wanted, what Lady Constance had said he valued, was genuine passion. She settled onto the bench, adjusted her position, and considered her choices. The safe option would be to play something simple and execute it flawlessly, demonstrating her technical training. But safe would be forgettable, and forgettable would not help her cause. Her fingers found the keys and she began to play Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, the second movement. It was technically beyond her current skill level. She knew she would make errors, but it was the only piece that seemed appropriate for this moment. Instead of trying to play it with the careful, controlled precision Professor Aldrich had taught her, Rosalind poured every emotion of the past weeks into the music. The fear she had felt in that carriage bound for Mrs. Fletcher's establishment, the desperate hope when the Earl had offered his hand, the exhaustion of endless training, the brief moments of triumph when she successfully navigated some social challenge, the crushing humiliation of her mother's public betrayal, the terror that she would lose everything she had fought so hard to achieve. All of it flowed through her hands into notes that rang with raw, unpolished feeling. She made mistakes. Her fingers stumbled on the more complex passages. Her tempo wavered. Her dynamics were inconsistent. But the emotion was absolutely genuine. And when the final chord faded into silence, she sat very still, her hands trembling slightly on the keys. The prince was silent for a long moment. Rosalind did not dare to look at him, certain she had failed catastrophically. Then he began to applaud, slow and deliberate. "That," he declared, moving closer, "is not technical perfection. Any paid musician can provide technical perfection, and I am bored senseless by it half the time. But what you just played contained genuine passion, and passion is what England needs more of in its young people. Too many of these society misses play like mechanical dolls, perfect and empty. You play like a woman who has suffered and survived, and that gives your music substance." He settled into a nearby chair, studying her with continued interest. "Montrose explained your situation in detail. Your mother's cruelty, your own resilience. Tell me, Miss Merrick, why should I care about one young woman's personal drama? Society is full of tragic stories." Rosalind met his gaze directly, remembering Lady Constance's advice about honesty. "You should not care about my personal drama, Your Highness. My story is insignificant in the grand scheme of the realm, but perhaps you might care about the principle it represents. How many talented people are destroyed by circumstances beyond their control? How many potential physicians, scientists, scholars are lost because society determines worth by birth rather than ability? It is a waste of the gifts God gave us. My mother sold me for £40 because she believed I was worthless. Lord Montrose saw something different. Dangerous philosophy, Miss Merrick. Society depends on people knowing and accepting their proper places. With respect, Your Highness, a truly ordered society depends on people contributing their talents, regardless of where they began. The surgeon who saves a prince's life is no less valuable because his father was a tradesman. The scholar who advances human knowledge is no less worthy because she was born female. To waste such talent is poor stewardship of the nation's resources." "She?" The prince's eyebrows rose. "You believe women capable of significant scholarship?" "I know they are, Your Highness. I assisted my father's medical practice for years. I saw him treat hundreds of patients, observed patterns in disease and treatment, and contributed ideas that improved outcomes. My sex did not make my observations less valid, or my mind less capable. Yet society would never allow you to practice medicine professionally, which is society's loss, not merely mine. How many brilliant female minds are wasted on needlework and watercolors when they could be serving the realm through science or medicine? The restriction is arbitrary and wasteful." The prince leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his features. "Adrian warned me you were dangerously intelligent. He understated the case considerably. "Tell me, Miss Merrick, what do you think of my home?" The abrupt change of subject was clearly a test. Rosalind glanced around the opulent room, at the gilding and the art and the excessive decoration. She could offer flattery and tell him it was magnificent, or she could be honest. "I think, Your Highness, that the cost of a single one of these chandeliers could fund a hospital ward for a year, treating hundreds of sick poor who currently die for want of basic care. But I also understand that a ruler must demonstrate power and wealth to maintain authority, both domestically and internationally, and that sometimes display serves purposes beyond mere aesthetics. So, while part of me sees waste, another part recognizes political necessity." The prince laughed, genuinely amused, diplomatic while being critical, honest while acknowledging complexity. "You are indeed a remarkable young woman, Miss Merrick. I have known too many weak-spined nobles who crumble at the first breath of scandal. I find it refreshing to encounter someone with steel in their spine who can play Beethoven with genuine feeling despite technical imperfection." He rose and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the immaculate gardens. "Last night's spectacle at the Worthingtons was unfortunate, but not unprecedented. Society thrives on scandal, and you have provided them with material for months of gossip. The question is whether that scandal destroys you or defines you as someone interesting enough to be worth knowing." "Your Highness," Rosalind began carefully, "I cannot control what society thinks of me. I can only control my own actions and hope they speak louder than my origins." "Well said. Then let me make this simple for you. You have my approval. I find Miss Rosalind Merrick to be not only an acceptable addition to the aristocracy, but a potentially valuable one. Her intelligence, her resilience, her refusal to be defeated by circumstances, these are qualities England needs. Anyone who questions my judgment on this matter can explain their reasoning to me personally, which I assure you they will not wish to do." He turned back to face her directly. "I am not doing this for you, Miss Merrick, charming though you are. I am doing this because Adrian Stratford is a valuable ally who does genuine good in Parliament, and he deserves support in his personal choices. I'm also doing this because I am tired of society's endless recycling of the same bloodlines and the same boring people. You represent something different, and I find different intriguing. Do not disappoint me. I shall do my utmost not to, Your Highness." "See that you do. Now leave me to my correspondence. Montrose is waiting for you in the east drawing-room, and I suspect he has been worrying himself into a state. Tell him I expect him at the Carlton House reception next week, and you will accompany him as my personally invited guest." Rosalind curtsied with all the precision Lady Constance had drilled into her, and withdrew. She found Adrian exactly where the prince had indicated, pacing the elegant room like a caged animal. He turned when she entered, his expression anxious. "Well?" "He gave his approval," Rosalind said, still slightly dazed by the entire interaction. "He called me dangerously intelligent and said I have steel in my spine. He also invited us both to a reception next week as his personally invited guests." Adrian's shoulders sagged with obvious relief. "Thank God. When he summoned you so quickly after last night, I feared he might have decided the scandal was too much. He seems to enjoy scandal as long as it interests him. He asked me what I thought of Carlton House." "What did you say?" "That a single chandelier could fund a hospital ward for a year, but that political necessity sometimes requires expensive display." Adrian stared at her for a moment, then laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "You criticized the Prince Regent's extravagance to his face." "I was honest but diplomatic about it. He seemed to appreciate the candor." "He would. George values intelligence and spirit over flattery, but most people are too frightened to show him anything but deference. I was too exhausted from last night's disaster to maintain careful deception. Besides, Lady Constance told me to be myself, and myself has opinions about wasteful spending when people are dying for want of basic medical care." They returned to Montrose House to find Lady Constance waiting with barely concealed anxiety. When Rosalind reported the outcome of the royal audience, the Dowager's expression transformed into something that might have been pride. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Merrick. The Prince's explicit approval changes everything. Society cannot afford to snub someone he has personally endorsed without risking his displeasure." The following days proved Lady Constance's assessment correct. Royal approval changed everything, with the brutal efficiency of a blade cutting through tangled thread. Within 2 days, the gossip shifted from scandalous origins to romantic rescue. The narrative transformed from poor girl attempting to social climb into brave young woman, saved from tragedy by a noble lord with the Prince Regent's blessing. Lady Victoria Ashworth found herself isolated rather than Rosalind. Her earlier calculated cruelty was now seen as poor sportsmanship, an attempt to destroy someone under royal protection. Mrs. Langley, always practical about social calculations, quietly shifted her allegiance. Mrs. Sutton, who had initially seemed skeptical, declared publicly that the girl had shown remarkable composure under fire and deserved respect. Even the most rigid matrons found it difficult to maintain their censure in the face of royal endorsement. Invitations began arriving at Montrose House, not just for Rosalind, but explicitly requesting both her and the Earl. The ton moved with its characteristic speed to align itself with the prince's judgment, and within a week, Rosalind found herself established rather than excluded. The 12th week arrived with shocking speed. Rosalind stood once again in the library at Montrose House, this time at the Earl's explicit request. He waited by the window, his posture rigid with what she had learned to recognize as carefully controlled emotion. "You have fulfilled every requirement of our bargain," he said without turning to face her. "My grandmother declares you not only acceptable, but exceptional. The prince himself has granted his approval. You are free to choose." "Choose?" Rosalind repeated carefully. "Marriage to me and the position of Countess of Montrose, or £2,000 and the independence to live as you wish. What do you want, my lord?" "That is irrelevant. The choice is yours to make freely." Something in his rigidly controlled tone ignited Rosalind's temper, which had been growing increasingly difficult to restrain over the past weeks of his studied distance. "Irrelevant? We have lived in the same house for 3 months. You have avoided me as though I carried some contagious disease, appearing only for formal dinners and scheduled assessments. Now you stand there pretending indifference and expect me to make a life-altering decision based on what? Gratitude? Fear? Certainly not on any understanding of your actual wishes, since you have taken extraordinary care to reveal nothing of yourself." The Earl's shoulders stiffened. "I maintained appropriate distance to ensure you felt no pressure to accept out of obligation." "Coward," Rosalind said clearly. He turned then, his dark eyes wide with shock. "I beg your pardon. You are a coward, my lord. You rescue women from brothels at dawn but cannot manage honest conversation with one woman over breakfast. You maintain agents across London but hide from emotional intimacy behind walls of propriety. You offer marriage as though proposing a business arrangement while pretending you have no personal interest in the outcome. Well, I refuse to participate in this theatre any longer. Tell me the truth. Do you want me to stay or do you want me to go?" The Earl stared at her for a long moment, and Rosalind watched his careful composure crack like ice under pressure. "You want the truth? Very well. I love you. I have loved you since the 2nd week of your training, when you laughed at some absurd comment my grandmother made, and I saw joy in your expression despite everything you had endured. I love your intelligence, your resilience, your refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have destroyed a weaker woman. I love the way you read medical texts when you think no one is watching, and how you help my grandmother's elderly maid with her rheumatism using your father's remedies. I love you so completely that the thought of you choosing to leave tears my heart to pieces." He took a step toward her, his expression raw with feeling. "But I will not trap you with my emotions. You deserve the freedom to choose your own path, not to accept marriage out of gratitude or pity, or because you feel you owe me something for saving you from a fate you should never have faced. If you choose to go, I will survive. I survived my wife's death, I will survive losing you. But if you choose to stay, if you choose me not because of my title or wealth, but because you truly wish to share your life with mine, then I swear I will spend every day proving worthy of that gift." Rosalind felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You are an idiot, my lord. I beg your pardon. An aristocratic, emotionally stunted idiot. Did it never occur to you during these past 12 weeks that I might have developed feelings of my own? That I noticed every time you appeared for dinner and watched you with the desperation of a woman starving for even a glimpse. That I fabricated questions about estate management and political theory just to hear you speak. That I fell in love with you not because you rescued me from immediate danger, but because you were kind to servants, patient with your grandmother's difficult moods, and maintained agents specifically to save women from the kind of horror you spared me. She moved closer, until only a foot of space separated them. I love you because you read philosophy late at night when you think the house is asleep, because you donate enormous sums to hospitals and schools but refuse any public recognition. I love the way you frown when you are worried about your tenants, because you looked at a penniless physician's daughter being sold into degradation and saw someone worth saving. I choose you, Adrian Stratford. Not your title, not your wealth, not the safety you offer. I choose the man who appears in Southwark at 5 in the morning because his conscience will not allow him to do otherwise. I choose you. The Earl's careful control shattered completely. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that suggested he had been restraining himself for far longer than 12 weeks. His mouth found hers in a kiss that contained all the emotion both had been suppressing, all the fear and hope and impossible longing. When they finally separated, Rosalind rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her cheek. "When shall we marry?" "As soon as possible," Adrian replied, his voice rough, "though my grandmother will insist on a proper engagement period and a wedding that demonstrates society's full acceptance." "Then let us disappoint her for once. I want a small ceremony at your estate in Yorkshire, with only the people who truly matter present. No grand performance for society's benefit, no elaborate display of wealth and status. Just us, making our vows before God and the few people we trust." Adrian pulled back to look at her, his expression transforming with surprised delight. "You would truly choose that over a fashionable London wedding?" "I would choose truth over theatre every time, my lord. Have you not learned that about me yet?" They married 4 weeks later at Montrose Hall in Yorkshire, a sprawling estate that commanded views of moorland stretching to distant hills. Lady Constance attended, her usual severity softened by something that might have been actual approval. The Prince Regent sent a wedding gift of shocking extravagance, along with a note expressing regret that affairs of state prevented his attendance. Lady Margaret Whitfield made the journey despite her age, declaring that she would not miss the wedding for anything. Even Adrian's younger sister, Lady Catherine, travelled from Scotland with her husband to witness the ceremony. The ceremony itself was brief and deeply personal, conducted in the estate's private chapel, with sunlight streaming through ancient stained glass. Rosalind wore a simple gown of ivory silk, rather than the elaborate creation society would have expected, and Adrian's expression as she walked toward him contained more genuine emotion than any speech could convey. The quiet intimacy of the chapel made their vows feel sacred, in a way no crowded London church ever could. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Adrian kissed her with tender reverence, Rosalind felt something settle in her chest that she slowly recognized as peace. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the deep certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The years that followed proved that certainty well-founded. The marriage that had begun as a desperate bargain transformed into a partnership of extraordinary depth. Adrian supported Rosalind's passionate interest in medicine, using his influence to secure her access to medical lectures that would normally exclude women. When she proposed establishing a school for orphaned girls that would teach them mathematics and sciences alongside traditional accomplishments, he provided the funding without hesitation. The first Merrick School for Girls opened in Bloomsbury 3 years after their marriage, in a modest building that had once served as a warehouse. Rosalind insisted on being present for every detail of its establishment, from hiring instructors to designing the curriculum. The initial skepticism from educators and society matrons was considerable. "You cannot seriously intend to teach orphan girls mathematics beyond basic arithmetic," one visiting inspector declared. "It is not suited to their station or their sex." "I intend to teach them everything necessary to support themselves through skilled work," Rosalind replied calmly. "Natural philosophy, practical accountancy, basic medical knowledge, bookkeeping, and yes, also the traditional accomplishments. A girl who can calculate compound interest and understand the natural world has far better prospects than one who can merely embroider samplers. The school accepted its first 20 students, girls ranging from age 10 to 16, all orphans or from destitute families. Rosalind selected instructors who shared her philosophy that female intelligence was not inferior, but merely underdeveloped through neglect. She taught several classes herself, finding deep satisfaction in watching young minds engage with challenging material. Within 2 years, the results were undeniable. Girls from the Merrick School were being hired as governesses, teachers, skilled assistants in apothecary shops, bookkeepers for merchants. Several went on to establish small businesses of their own. The success attracted both admiration and criticism, but the Prince Regent's continued support and Adrian's political influence provided protection against the harshest opposition. By the 10th year of their marriage, the Merrick schools had expanded to 5 institutions across London and Yorkshire. Each maintained the same rigorous curriculum, the same refusal to accept limitations based on sex or social class. Rosalind published several treatises on female education that created substantial controversy, but slowly began to shift certain progressive attitudes. She argued, with evidence drawn from her school's outcomes, that women's apparent intellectual inferiority resulted from inadequate education rather than innate capacity. Adrian used his position in Parliament to advocate for reforms to child welfare laws, specifically targeting the legal loopholes that allowed parents to sell their children. The legislation was slow and faced fierce opposition from those who valued parental rights over child protection, but incremental progress was made. Each small victory represented lives saved, children protected, futures secured. Society's response to the Earl and Countess of Montrose evolved from scandal to grudging acceptance to eventual respect. They were recognized as an unusual couple who defied conventional expectations, but whose genuine partnership and measurable social contributions could not be dismissed. Lady Constance, who lived to the remarkable age of 92, declared on her deathbed that her grandson's unconventional marriage had been the best decision of his life, and that Rosalind had become the daughter she had never had. The couple had 4 children. 3 daughters, each of whom received education equal to any son, and who pursued studies in medicine, botany, and mathematics, respectively. Their eldest, Catherine, shocked society by attending medical lectures at universities that reluctantly admitted her based on her mother's reputation and her father's influence. Their second daughter, Margaret, studied botanical specimens from around the empire and published illustrated volumes that became standard references. Their youngest daughter, Anne, demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability and contributed to astronomical calculations used in navigation. Their son, James, the heir to the earldom, proved his parents' staunchest supporter. Rather than resenting his sister's accomplishments, he celebrated them and used his eventual position to expand the network of schools his mother had founded. He married a woman of similar progressive sympathies, and together they ensured the Merrick legacy continued into the next generation. Mrs. Helena Merrick died impoverished 12 years after selling her daughter, having burned every bridge and exhausted every resource. She had spent her final years in a bitter obscurity, watching from a distance as the daughter she had sold rose to heights she could never reach, knowing that her own actions had ensured she would never share in that triumph. Society, terrified of offending the Prince Regent, shunned her completely. Rosalind received word of her mother's death with neither grief nor satisfaction, simply a sad acknowledgement that some people were incapable of change. She did not attend the funeral and never spoke of her mother again, directing her energy instead toward the hundreds of young women who benefited from the opportunities she created. Lady Victoria Ashworth made a wealthy match to a marquess's son, but was observed at social events watching the Earl and Countess of Montrose with barely concealed envy. The genuine affection between them was obvious to everyone, the way they moved as partners through political and social challenges, the respect they showed each other's work and opinions. No amount of wealth or status could manufacture such connection, and Victoria's marriage, while financially advantageous, lacked the depth that characterized the Montroses' union. 20 years after that desperate dawn in Suffolk, Rosalind visited the Bloomsbury School on a crisp autumn morning. She was now 40 years old, her dark hair showing threads of silver, her manner carrying the confidence of someone who had transformed personal suffering into meaningful purpose. She walked through the familiar corridors, greeting students and instructors, observing lessons with the practiced eye of someone who understood both pedagogy and practical outcomes. In one of the advanced classrooms, she encountered a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Winters, studying medical texts with the same intensity Rosalind remembered from her own youth. The girl was small, thin, with anxious eyes that suggested a difficult past. She looked up as the Countess entered, and her hands trembled slightly as she set down her book. "I do not belong here," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with fear. "I am not clever enough, not good enough. Everyone expects me to fail. I should not be wasting valuable space and resources that could go to someone worthier." Rosalind recognized that desperation intimately. She had felt it herself, that crushing certainty of inadequacy, that terror of disappointing people who had invested faith in her potential. She sat beside the girl and took the medical text from her trembling hands, glancing at the complex anatomical diagrams. 20 years ago," Rosalind said quietly, "I was exactly where you are now. I had been sold by my mother for £40 to a brothel in Suffolk. I was rescued through what seemed like divine intervention by a man I did not know. I was given an opportunity that terrified me because I was absolutely certain I would fail. I was convinced I was not clever enough, not worthy enough, not anything enough. But I survived. More than survived, I learned that my worth was not determined by my origins or by other people's judgments, but by my own choices and efforts." Sarah's eyes widened with shock. "But you are a countess. You have always belonged to this world." "I was born into poverty and sold into degradation," Rosalind replied calmly. "My mother valued me at exactly £40, the price of a decent horse. I had no education in the things society valued, no connections, no beauty or charm to recommend me. Everything I became through desperate effort and the support of people who chose to see potential rather than limitations. You have that same opportunity now. The choice is yours. You can believe the voices that tell you that you do not belong, that you are not good enough, that your efforts are wasted, or you can prove them wrong through your own determination. Which will you choose?" The girl's expression slowly transformed from fear to something harder and more determined. "I choose to prove them wrong." "Excellent. Then let us review this chapter on anatomy together, and I will explain the errors in the author's understanding of female physiology. There are several, which gives us opportunity to practice critical thinking rather than blind acceptance of authority." They spent an hour together, Rosalind guiding Sarah through the material with the same patience her own instructors had shown her. The girl was indeed intelligent. Her earlier fear had been blocking her natural capacity. As understanding dawned and confidence grew, Rosalind saw the transformation she had witnessed in hundreds of students over the years. Sarah Winters did prove them wrong, becoming one of the first women licensed to practice medicine in England 15 years later. She attributed her success to the Countess of Montrose's support and example, joining the growing number of women whose lives had been transformed by Rosalind's refusal to accept the limitations society tried to impose. Sarah eventually established a clinic serving indigent patients in East London, providing care to those who could never afford traditional physicians, continuing the legacy of service that Rosalind had modelled. On a warm summer evening in 1836, exactly 20 years after that fateful dawn in Suffolk, an elderly couple sat on a stone bench in the gardens of Montrose Hall, watching the sun set over the Yorkshire moors. Rosalind's hair had gone silver, though her grey eyes remained as sharp and observant as ever. Adrian's tall frame was slightly bent with age, his dark hair white at the temples, but his hand holding hers was still strong and steady. Around them, the gardens bloomed with late summer flowers, their scent heavy on the warm air. In the distance, they could hear the laughter of grandchildren playing on the lawn under the watchful eyes of nurses. The next generation of Stratfords, being raised with the same values of service and intellectual curiosity that had defined their grandparents' lives. "Regrets?" Adrian asked, the question that had become something of a private joke between them over the years, asked in moments of contentment to affirm their shared satisfaction with the choices that had brought them here. Not a single one, Rosalind replied, leaning her head against his shoulder in the comfortable intimacy of decades together. Every difficult moment, every challenge, every battle we fought was worth it. I found you. I found purpose. I found a way to transform my own suffering into opportunities for others. If I could return to that terrified girl in the carriage bound for Southwark and tell her what her future held, she would never believe me. Adrian kissed her hair, a gesture made tender by repetition and genuine affection. You transformed far more than yourself. You transformed the world around you, one young woman at a time. 5 schools, hundreds of graduates, countless lives altered. And you transformed me from a man afraid of his own heart into someone capable of genuine love and partnership. We transformed each other, Rosalind corrected gently. You gave me the opportunity, but you also learned from me. You became a better advocate, a more effective reformer, because you listened to someone from outside your privileged perspective. That is no small thing. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something remarkable from the fragments of disaster. The girl who had been sold for £40 had become a countess who changed hundreds of lives. The Earl who had rescued her at dawn had found the love he had stopped believing possible. In schools across England, young women studied mathematics and medicine and science, learning that their worth was not determined by their birth or beauty, but by their minds and their courage. They carried forward the legacy of a woman who had refused to let cruelty and circumstance define her destiny, who had transformed degradation into dignity, who had proven that human value cannot be measured in currency. The £40 that had once represented the price of a life had been transformed into something priceless, a lesson written in living proof that mothers who betray their children deserve their lonely fates, that good men deserve the love they offer, that second chances can birth extraordinary futures, and that the human spirit cannot be purchased or sold, regardless of the price named. As the last light faded from the summer sky and the first stars emerged, Rosalind and Adrian rose together and walked slowly back toward the house where their family waited. Behind them, the gardens settled into evening quiet, and ahead, lamplight glowed warm in the windows of home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.